everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. My name is Brittany Fallon, and I am the lobbyist for the Rio Grande chapter of the Sierra Club. And what that means is that my job is to write and edit and advocate for environmental legislation in our state legislature. You have a handout on your chairs that talks about the theme of the night, which is climate change. And we have three panelists tonight who have real-world experience working on climate change issues. Laura Paskus, Ray Powell, and Kelsey Radar. And we'll be hearing from them each in turn. But first I wanted to just make sure that everybody's on the same page about climate change. First of all, how many people in the room were taught about climate change in school? I'm betting not very many. I see 3 hands up. How many people are familiar with the concept of climate change? You know it's something. How many people feel like they understand climate change? Okay, that's very impressive. I should have known I'm at an active community event. So everybody knows about the ice ages, for example. That is an example of climate change. But the climate change that we're facing today is not the same as that. That's a very common comparison that you get from climate change deniers is, oh, there's been ice ages before. But the difference in the climate change of today is that it's being caused by humans. And it's being caused by an increase in global warming that is enhancing at a rapidity that's never been seen before in the Earth's history that we know of. It's also different because it's not consistent the way that the Ice Age was, for example. What our climate change is erratic climate. It means we're going to have more floods, we're going to have more drought, we're going to have more wildfires. And it's all going to happen very erratically. It doesn't mean, oh, global warming, everything's gonna be hotter all the time. We're gonna have peaks and valleys, and it's gonna be unpredictable and it's gonna be violent. And we're already seeing some of that, right? We've seen that with Hurricane Maria. We've seen that with the wildfires in California, which I would describe as apocalyptic. I'm sure you all saw the photo of the golfers golfing while the hills behind them in LA were just fully in flames. That for me is a moment that I'll remember forever as a turning point in climate change. And New Mexico is highly at risk because we are a desert system. Drought is already a problem in New Mexico, and climate change is going to make it worse. And at the same time, we're also going to see bigger and more frequent floods from our rivers. And right now, we don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. That's something that the Army Corps of Engineers are working on, for example, in the Rio Grande in Albuquerque. So I had the pleasure of working on a couple different pieces of legislation this session that impact climate change. One of them was the Energy Transition Act, which is going to get New Mexico to 100% clean energy by 2045. And the reason why this is such a, yes, thank you. I was part of a really big team, but that is definitely going to be one of the crowning achievements of my lifetime, for sure. And I have a PhD, so that was much bigger in my opinion. So the International Panel on Climate Science put out this report in 2018, which I'm sure you all are aware of, that said if we do not reverse the rise in global warming by 2.7 degrees above the pre-industrial average by 2040, we're screwed. And so the reason why the ETA, the Energy Transition Act, is so important is because it gets us as a state to that level by 2040 when the scientists predict that we need to change. And that was why we set those date goals. The other reason why that bill is important is because it played a role in closing the San Juan Generating Station, which is a coal-fired generating station in the San Juan region. The reason why that is important is because this same IPCC report said that we need to reduce our coal production. It's currently at 40%. we need to reduce it to between 1% and 7% by 2050. And again, the Energy Transition Act puts New Mexico on that path, which is fantastic. I also worked on a bill with Representative Melanie Stansbury on climate resiliency and with Representative Andrea Romero on an energy efficiency bill. And what both of those are basically is just being frugal with what we have. If we have buildings, are they using energy efficiently? If we have windows, are they keeping the heat that we're producing in our houses? And it's not very sexy and it's not very newsworthy, but it's very important. It's just being cautious with the resources that we already have and making sure that we're using them as responsibly as we can. And I think that we'll see a lot more of that type of legislation moving forward as we realize that things like once in a lifetime 100% carbon-free bills aren't going to happen every year. But things like the average citizen using better light bulbs and using fewer single-use plastics are going to make a difference. And at this point, I'm going to move to our first panelist, Laura Paskus, who is an award-winning journalist. And she is going to talk about her firsthand experience reporting on climate change issues in New Mexico and elsewhere in the West. Laura Paskus.
Should I use this one instead? It looks intimidating. I'm just going to use this one and hopefully not bug you too much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I love talking about super depressing issues like climate change. Just kidding. No, I do love talking about climate change. I am a journalist here in New Mexico. I've been covering the environment kind of in the interior western United States since 2002. I started my career at High Country News. These days I work for New Mexico Political Report and also New Mexico PBS. And I would say that I've been covering climate change basically since the very beginning of my career. My first news story at High Country News was about the Rio Grande drying in the summer. And I've continued to cover climate and water issues pretty closely and carefully for the past 17 years. And here in New Mexico, I feel like a lot of people, and especially folks in this room, are pretty well informed about what climate change is and what climate change isn't. But I just want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the main impacts that we're already seeing here in the state and that we can anticipate seeing intensify over the years. And so we are an arid state. We are accustomed to low average precipitation levels. But what climate change does is, as our region warms, warming means drying for an already arid place. And so what that means on average is as temperatures continue to increase every year, and we do see that since the 1970s, New Mexico has warmed at a rate even faster than the global average. So since the 1970s, we've warmed 2 degrees Fahrenheit already. So some of the ways that we see that are our snowpack on average is moving further up the mountains and further north. Our spring runoff tends to happen earlier than it did in the past and earlier than our infrastructure is really designed to handle. We also see larger, more intense wildfires and a much longer wildfire season than in the past. So all of these things have major economic and social impacts all across the state, from the farming and ag and ranching communities to tourism to energy supplies. The hotter it is, the more air conditioning we use. Most of our energy in the state, most of our electricity in the state still comes from coal-fired power plants. There's also public health impacts, whether that's asthma or respiratory diseases, dust storms. Are you all depressed? Come on. We have more frequent dust storms, a longer dust storm season, and also diseases like valley fever, which are spreading north, which used to be really contained kind of in southern Arizona, and very extreme southern New Mexico is creeping northward. I think it's reached Sierra County at this point, and also things like West Nile disease. So it's a really big deal, and it really touches everyone's lives in the state, whether you're a farmer or a clinician or a student or whatever you are, climate change affects you. And I think, if I had been sitting here this time last year, I would be super unpleasant. Last year was a really, really hard year for New Mexico. We had almost no snowpack, which meant this time of year last year, the Rio Grande was already dry south of Albuquerque, and it was running at a few hundred, maybe 500, 400 CFS, even here in Albuquerque. If you've been out to the river this year, you know that's a totally different story. And so that's not to say that climate change isn't happening. If you have any of those friends who want to talk to you about that, we can talk later about some strategies for dealing with people like that. But one really important thing to think about this year, that I've been thinking about a lot this year, as we've had good snowpack and as we have this beautiful river running through our city right now, we're one of the last cities in the western United States that has a living river running through our city. So many other western cities, their rivers have dried, they're over-allocated, they're not what we have here. And I think this year is a really good reminder to appreciate what we have, to plan for the future, and to recognize that as the world changes, it is really hard to not feel discouraged. It's really hard to not fear for your children's future. And it's really hard to not feel helpless in the face of something so vast and so global that we ourselves have created, but we oftentimes feel helpless to address. But I think this year is a wonderful reminder for everyone that this world that we have is beautiful, and it is worth fighting for, and it is worth believing in, and it is worth setting aside cynicism and feelings of hopelessness and helplessness to embrace the future that we have unfortunately created, even if we were to stop all carbon and methane emissions today. The fact is that we have already changed our atmosphere to the point where the warming will continue for a pretty long time. And so this is our world, and we can cut emissions, we should be doing all sorts of things in terms of mitigation, and we should be thinking about adaptation. But I really think it's really important to find what is beautiful and valuable about the world that we have now and to not give up on it. And I know it's an easy thing for me to be saying this year when we have a beautiful, good year, but I think right now is when you find your reserves and you stake your claim on the future and you start working really hard and ensuring that anyone in elected office is addressing climate change and talking about water issues. Last year, because last year was so bad, more lawmakers were talking about water issues than at any point in my career. And it was wonderful that they were doing that. You have to make sure that this year, on a good water year, they continue to be doing that and to continue to support people like Melanie Sansbury, who are doing really interesting, innovative, and good things when it comes to water in the state. And so I also think that in New Mexico, we have a really unique opportunity here. We all know each other, for better or for worse, right? I mean, I walked in here and knew at least 3 people. We all know each other. We're a small state. Across the aisle, we can work together in this state, and we can make changes that are important for New Mexico and New Mexicans in the future. And so I recognize that y'all are Democrats, and I think I probably lean mostly towards supporting Democrats, but I think it's really important to also be educating your Republican friends and neighbors and lawmakers, because climate change is not a partisan issue. And I think my 8 minutes are up.
Thank you so much. That wasn't that depressing, was it? She ended on a high note. Our next panelist is Ray Powell, who is the former state land commissioner and an ecologist. Yes, thank you. And also just has a very interesting career as a veterinarian, worked with Dr. Jane Goodall, and he's going to be talking about his experience with climate change through the lens of state lands and as an ecologist. Ray?
Thank you. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many friends, and some I've known most of my life here. You know, I could give my 8-minute speech, and the only thing I think that sums it up, the one sentence, is a person's heart away from nature becomes hard. And that's from Chief Standing Bear of the Lakota Oglala Sioux. That sums it up. If you're disconnected from the natural world, you don't care and you don't get it. Growing up in New Mexico, we rode our horses across this area before there were houses, and ran into pueblos and petroglyphs, and I became an anthropologist. I was interested in cultural anthropology, and realized that the people that I saw the ruins of were the kids I was going to school with. They hadn't died off. They're still here. And they faced a lot of real perturbations in weather, and they have a lot of wisdom, most of which the dominant culture has ignored. I went back to school and got my master's in plant ecology and systematic botany, and I've walked over a good portion of New Mexico, almost all of it, and I've seen it change. Went back to school again and got my degree in veterinary medicine with major interest in wildlife, and was headed to Somalia to do public health when my dad, who had a chromosomal defect for politics, decided I inherited that, decided to run for governor, and came back to New Mexico. I mention that because that's the lens that I'm looking through, the plants and the animals and the people of New Mexico. And as 14 years at the land office, off and on, over 30 years, every time I thought they were screwing it up, our team went back and tried to put the wheels back on the bus. And I just want to give you 2 quick stories about New Mexico that I think reflect the part of the predicament we're in. My dad came to New Mexico during World War II, and he ended up over at Sandia Labs. And there was a guy, a Democrat, running for president named Jimmy Carter. And nobody knew Jimmy Carter when he came to New Mexico. I mean, literally nobody. And he ended up at our kitchen table, and he and my dad were talking about how could we do things differently if he would get elected. He didn't even measure at 1% at that point in time. Well, he got there. And his point was, we've got to get off of the fossil fuels, and we've got to get on to renewables. And with my dad and other people, they got Sandia Labs 38% of their money to non-weapons research. And they built the solar tower. And they put money into ideas that if you win the peace, you don't have to fight the war. And they understood that it was important to have a strong national defense, but why fight the war if you don't have to? Well, I was back at veterinary school, and I called my dad, who was my best friend, and he was crying. My dad didn't cry very often. I thought, oh, the dog got ran over, my mom's in trouble, what's wrong? He said, I just got a call from the White House, and they said if they could fire me, they'd fire me right now. They said, you SOB, I want you to know that as of this moment, every cent goes back to weapons research. Forget that crap with renewable energy. And that was in 1980. So, you know, we've had opportunity after opportunity because we've understood this for decades, literally decades. When I left the land office about 5 years ago, thanks to the great people I was working with, we had $585 million in renewable projects in the pipeline. We built the largest solar array, the largest wind farm, the largest geothermal project, but $580 million to go online the first week of January. We thought we'd be back there. Well, we lost by 654 votes. The next person that followed me dumped all of that and went right back to catering to the oil and gas industry. So, you know, I'd say I've been an apocalyptic optimist for the last decade. And those of you that know what that means, it means you know it's going to shit, but you hope it's going to turn out okay. I hate to tell you, folks, at this point, I'm not there anymore. We've baked in so much, and Laura mentioned several aspects of it, so much change into the system that I really feel that we've got to do the very best we can for our kids and our grandkids to be able to adapt to what's coming, because it's coming hard and it's coming fast. And I'd love to tell you that changing your light bulbs and doing that sort of thing really was going to change things. It's important. Don't stop doing it. But we've got to focus, absolutely complete focus on climate change. When we were at the land office, I served during Gary Johnson. I block his name out. Gary Johnson and Susana Martinez's terms. And we got things done in spite of, not because of help from that office. Well, the good news, and the good news thanks to many in this room, we have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic governor. And I'll tell you what, if we don't push as much as fast as we can through that window right now, then shame on us. And so we can't play the game of, well, I'm really going to suck up to the fossil fuel industry because I need their contributions, but I'm really for climate change. It doesn't work that way, folks. And having dealt, we've been lucky to have lots of fossil fuels, but we now realize the cost that we're paying that goes with it. And we can't pretend any longer. So the point being is that if our elected officials that we've elected don't stand up right now and push it through as fast as we can, then our kids and grandkids are literally doomed. Because ground zero, I hate to say it, Laura, but is right here in the southwestern United States. It's going to get so hot and so dry that you're not going to be able to stay here. Not in 50 years. This year is an anomaly, and I hate to say it, but it's happening at a bad time because it's put people back to sleep and said, no, there's really not climate change. Look at the river, how fast it's running. Look at the snowpack. This is an anomaly. And so I hate to say it, but it's hair on fire time right now. And I can't say it any other way. You know, there are three different approaches right now. And I know I'm getting close to my 8 minutes here, so I'll speed it up. And that is to fix things, the new Green Deal. That's important. We need to do as much of that as we possibly can, as fast as we can. Cut greenhouse emissions, adopt a carbon tax, CO2 sequestration, electric vehicles, energy efficient standards, curb methane emissions, and the use of hydrocarbons. That will slow things up a little bit. That'll give us a little bit more time. The second is to fix things and, you know, mitigate things and fix it. I don't think we can. I'd be lying to you if I thought we could. But we've got to do absolutely everything we can. And the third, and that's what I subscribe to at this point, is adaptation. And that is put as much money as we can and as much emphasis as we can in our kids' education. I mean, we've watched over the last 8 years in New Mexico this squabble about how we educate our kids and give them test after test after test of things they have to memorize. Well, the reality is the world is changing so fast. What we got to teach them is how to think and how to look at the big picture over a long period of time and how the pieces fit together, not thinking in little boxes. So when we talk about a moonshot for education, it's got to be a real moonshot for education, or our kids really don't have a chance. I think the other thing, and this is a political thing to say, but I see the world, and having worked with Jane Goodall and traveled with Jane Goodall, and she's in 160 countries around the globe, 85 years old and still traveling 300 days a year. What I saw was fascism literally rearing its ugly head all across the globe. And who would have thought in the United States of America that we'd be at the point right now where if you're Hispanic and get on a Southwest airline, you're going to have people that say they won't sit next to you. That happened to one of the kids that I grew up with last week. Southwest Airlines, I hate to say, didn't do anything. So we're in a really, really odd time, really a perfect storm in terms of our politics, in terms of the science. And so it means we've got to do the best we can in 2020 to take things back, not in a little way, but the biggest way possible to have the biggest wave that we can have from the top to the bottom. Because it's those city councilors, those county commissioners, those judges, our Secretary of State that are going to make a difference and make sure that they support those big decisions that we've got to make. How am I doing with my 8 minutes?
We're
Have I passed it?
Thank you so much.
Okay. Let me just say one more thing. And those of us that are in this room, does anybody in here not believe in climate change? Okay. Well, I think one of the things that we're the ambassadors for talking to our friends and family that may not believe it. And I'll just end up, my wife's a professor in communication at the university. And what she taught me is about 7% of what we communicate to another person is our speech. You guys aren't going to remember what I've said the minute you walk out of here. 35% of what we take away from another human being's communication is their tone. Whether they're aggressive, whether they're empathetic, whether they care about what we're saying. 55% is our body language. And if those three things don't match up, people don't believe you, period. And being a veterinarian, I learned that real quickly, because if those three things don't match up, my patient would bite me in the exam table. The reason I mention that is we've got to push as hard as we can to get as many people to go out and vote for people that will make a positive long-term decision. So I apologize for going over time, but I thank each and every one of you for being here tonight and for making a positive difference.
Thank you so much. And that was a great note to end on the importance of our elected officials, because our next panelist currently holds 2 public offices. She's the sustainability officer for the city of Albuquerque, and she's also a commissioner on the Water Quality Control Board, and she's also a lawyer. And if Albuquerque had not elected Tim Keller as mayor, she might not be here doing all of the amazing work that she's doing, which is going to be fighting climate change on the city level. And she's going to be talking to us today about the different programs that the city of Albuquerque is working on. Kelsey.
Hi. Good evening, Westside Dems. Thanks so much for having me tonight. And, I got to make the classic joke of it's a tough act to follow, but it has to be said. But I really have to honor Ray and Laura for paving the way for people like us to always make a difference and to really continue the conversations that are just so important and give the attention to the issues that really need attention. So just thankful to be here. But you know, I want to echo first what Laura and Ray are talking about, that we are really experiencing a time of opportunity right now. I think that we all know it, but I have the luxury of seeing it at a citywide level, and I have the luxury of interacting with other cities across the country. And we are really very lucky, and for a lot of reasons, because of the efforts that you all make at the community level, we're able to push through legislation, we're able to make action right now that a lot of other cities, definitely a lot of other countries, and definitely a lot of other states cannot do right now. And they're looking to New Mexico as a leader. So that's really exciting news. And in the context of all of this, we're talking a lot about statewide actions and federal actions that are happening, but cities really play an incredibly important role in all of this. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of what's going on behind the curtain so I can get you guys excited about what we're up to. So first, I want to cue us up real quick to talk about the American Cities Climate Challenge Award. So this is a grant award that was brought forth by Bloomberg Philanthropies in light of the Trump administration pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. So this is just another success story that I really want to highlight that, as devastating as it was to watch the federal government pull us way back and, the disappointment that we all felt that we were taking so many steps backward after the Obama administration had really been trying so aggressively to keep us on top of climate change policy. Really, what happened in lieu of that was cities stepped up, states stepped up, and private equity stepped up as well to say, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to see cities as an opportunity for investment to fight climate change. So, we often hear the term that cities are laboratories. They're able to make change really quickly. They're able to interact with each other, try new things, put pilot projects forth that other states and other jurisdictions can look at and get ideas from and start massaging. And so, really, Mike Bloomberg saw that opportunity and said, we're going to put $25 million aside, and we're going to pick 25 cities. And then for each of those cities, we're going to give them the in-kind assistance that they need, so the technical resources, marketing, access to networks that we otherwise would have had to pay thousands of dollars for, opportunities for employees like myself to attend nationwide conferences and workshops where we talk about things like equity in electric vehicles and access to those programs, and really cutting edge ideas to bring back to our cities and give us the institutional knowledge we otherwise wouldn't have had. And really focus on making sure that have goals and deliverables that we can have the support through this network to turn around and achieve here on the city level. So just generally, like I was saying, the American Cities, the ACCC grant, as I call it, it's a little bit of a mouthful otherwise, focuses on the main areas of climate change that were up there on the board. So what we did, our former Chief of Staff, Sunil Stewart, went ahead and said, we're going to put ourselves forth we're going to put Albuquerque forth in applying for this grant, and out of hundreds of applicants, the city of Albuquerque was selected as one of 25 cities to receive this grant award, which is really huge, really, really huge. And we're competing not with little cities, with Farmsville, Ohio, or something like that. We're competing with Chicago, with Atlanta, with major cities across the country, all the big guys. So I think that they saw within Albuquerque a unique opportunity, like Laura was mentioning. We're a small town state, we know each other, we're willing to organize, we're willing to focus our attention. We have really incredible communities of color, we have many people from diverse backgrounds, and we're really willing to step up to the plate despite some of the disadvantages we might have in comparison to some of our other cities. So in turn, we made some promises to them that we are making good on right now. First, we're focusing on our municipal energy demand. And Brittany was saying earlier that energy efficiency may not be the most sexy topic, but we're really honing in on that right now. So we are doing 2 deliverables around that. We're making sure that we are using a 3% of our CIP funding that has been set aside, And I'll give you all a little bit of a scoop. There is going to be, there's movement right now on talking about increasing that coming out of the Albuquerque Energy Council. And what that does is make sure that there's a steady stream of funding set aside in the city's budget to focus on upgrading our energy and our energy use, upgrading our lighting and mechanical upgrades, doing LED light conversions, so that we are reducing the energy use in all of our city buildings. We are also going to make, some of that funding is utilized towards solar panels, which I'll get to a little bit later. So our other big goal is that we are going to be meeting our municipal energy demand, our electricity use, by 65% renewables by 2021. And we are going to be shooting for 100% renewables by no later than 2030. And there's a lot of movement on that. I'll be talking about where we're at. We're also focusing on electric vehicles. So we're making sure that we're going to be applying for VW settlement funding. That's that big pot of funding when VW did us dirty. We got a whole bunch of money up at the state level that we can apply for. This next round could be anywhere around $3 million. And we're going to be applying for that funding. We're going to be putting out electric vehicle charging stations across city facilities so that if you're thinking about buying an EV, if you know someone who has an EV, we want to follow the industry projections and say that this is a norm. This is something, we have charging stations available to support your need if you want to have an electric vehicle, and really show that this is the trajectory we're on. Electric vehicles are what the future is, and all the major auto industry companies are falling in line with that. So we want to reflect that on the city side, that yes, that this is something you can use, this is something you can buy, and see that in a very physical way. We are also going to be converting 63% of our light-duty fleet to electric vehicles by 2025. Very exciting. We are also going to be looking at energy efficiency again by issuing a private sector challenge. We are going to shoot to get at least 20 buildings enrolled and have them commit to reducing their energy use by 20% within 5 years. And I really like to talk about this deliverable because, again, I believe it was Laura that might have been mentioning this, with our conservative friends, our private business folks. It's really important to create the connection and have the conversation that it's not contrary to their interests to acknowledge climate change, to incorporate it as part of their business plan. Sometimes I joke that all it took was a video of a sea turtle to get plastic straws outed. And I think that really is resonating within private industry to say that your customer base is demanding that you make sure that you are not negatively impacting the environment and that you are taking steps to ensure that you are benefiting it and at the very minimum, not creating harm. So that is just a conversation I always like to bring up because I just think it's so important, because it's going to require everyone to, climate change requires everybody to take action. So finally, we're also making sure that we're pushing on legislative and policy reform for renewable energy and for environmental justice issues. This last session, the city pushed community solar, and we're looking forward to this next session and working with the governor's office to see what's coming up next. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit now that I've told you all these goals. So where we're at now, we've been hustling. So I like to pride myself on being a doer, and I like to work with people who like to do as well. And so at this point with renewable energy, we have 24 out of 29 projects that are funded through the Krebs grant. These are small-scale solar projects up and running. They are all underway and in various stages of completion. And we're estimating that they're going to be completed about summer 2020. So for the energy nerds in here, when all those projects are completed, that's going to be about 10 megawatts. That's almost 11% of the city's renewable energy use. 11% of the city's energy use generally, sorry. So I just wanted to give you guys a couple shout outs too here on the west side. So we have Ladera Golf Course has got their small scale solar. We've got the fire stations 18 and 21 that also got solar panels. And we are very excited. So as a part of this grant, we have received a climate advisor who's going to start attending some of these events with me as well. And she's an employee of NRDC, and she's working with Albuquerque Energy Council. And I highly encourage any of you to attend those meetings. They are, I believe, the second Wednesday of the month. You can find the information on the city website. But if you really want to dig in on these issues, here at the city's going on a more regular basis. That's a really great place to attend, have a little bit of public comment, and find out what's going on. So they're also working with us very closely on developing the future projects that are going to help get us to that 100%. So in the energy efficiency space, we've got mechanical and lighting upgrades planned on 17 facilities through 2023. Some of the current projects we got going on is the Chemo Theater, North Domingo Baca and Manzano Mesa, and we've also got Lomas and Tramway Library up and running. And for Westside, we've already got some knocked out. We got the West Mesa Aquatic Center, fire stations 18 and 21 again, the Westside Animal Shelter, and the Westside Environmental Health Department Air Quality Facility all have had lighting and mechanical upgrades and are included in our energy efficiency plan. And then finally, with electric vehicles, a couple of you may have seen this. We put out a survey just recently on the Albuquerque Twitter page, and it got picked up by KRQE. And we were asking people who own EVs, who are thinking about having EVs, to give us some information so we can have a better idea of what EV users would like to see and where their charging stations are placed. Do you want them downtown? Do you want them in parking lots? How long are you spending time in certain places? So we've got a contract with the Nature Conservancy that's currently underway, and they are gathering all the information. So this is really fun. We were thinking that initially we might not get much more than maybe 20, 30 survey responses. We really didn't know quite what to expect. With all the attention and all the enthusiasm and incitement from the city, we got over 300 survey responses. People are obviously really excited about this issue, and we just want to ride that momentum and really help create the advocacy that's going to go along with that, as well as the education on electric vehicles. So everyone doesn't have that hesitancy when they're looking at them, that they feel that this is really a viable option for your future, for your family car, and we're working to help make that possible for all of our Buqueños. And so finally, I'll just tease this a little bit. I don't want to take away too much thunder for future press releases, but we do have a contract in process right now to bring on some of our first electric vehicles into the city fleet ever. And that will be coming on this year. That's not going to be 3 or 4 years from now. So really great news with that. So if we got the next slide. So I know that you guys are all really great champions of climate change mitigation. So, I don't really have to go into why this work is so important, but I really like to hit on this anyway, that when we're thinking about climate change and when we're thinking about all the activities that we're doing currently, we are estimating that by 2022, with our LED light conversions, with the renewable energy that we'll be procuring, as well as the energy efficiency upgrades that we'll be making, we are hoping to eliminate over 93,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide by 2022. And when you guys have a chance, I'd pay a little extra attention to the years on this graph, because as you can see, I just want to give Mayor Keller a shout out here, that in the last couple of years, so looking from 2014 to 2017, there was about 12,000 tons of CO2 eliminated, excuse me. And then when you look at 2018 to what we're projecting to 2021, that's going to be over 60,000. That's triple the amount that was made in the last administration. And I think that's a concrete result of your voting. So when we give issues attention, when we put our emotional energy on them, our calls, our votes, they do result in tangibles. And these are the kinds of tangibles they result in. So I think, aside from this, I want to give a couple little hopeful shout outs as well that aren't on these slides. I just want to tag team on what Laura and Ray are reiterating, that, again, like I said, we all know each other, and that is a strength. That is a huge strength that we have in the state of New Mexico. And that manifests itself in having conversations that maybe other communities and other states and other cities can't necessarily have. We're each other's neighbors, we're each other's friends, and I think that there's a lot of ways to connect climate change to people and the things that they are concerned about. So, sometimes people aren't necessarily concerned about melting ice caps and polar bears and that kind of thing, but I think as neighbors we can always say there's another way to have this conversation, and I always want to push us to finding new ways to connect and finding new ways to think about climate change in the many ways it impacts us. And I also want to say that I think you guys should be very excited that in our city government, there's just so many champions of this incredible work. I'm just a sort of spokesperson at this point, but behind me are 15, 20 people that are all showing up every day and putting in the work, putting the sweat, the tears, and all of the emotional energy behind making this work in the most thoughtful way that we possibly can. And we're having conversations with other cities. So, we're talking to Flagstaff, we're talking to Las Cruces, we're talking to Chicago, and we're talking to California. And the things that we're talking about are really exciting. And I think one of the biggest things that I took away from this most recent conversation I was having with some of those cities is that fighting climate change can sometimes be a privilege. So it disparately impacts people of color in low-income communities. And I think in New Mexico, we have a really exciting opportunity to say that we want to make sure that climate change and fighting climate change is an equity issue, and that everyone should be entitled to make decisions and have access to electric vehicles and access to renewable energy and access to energy efficiency, so that it is not a privileged fight, that it is a fight and an accomplishment that everyone can feel regardless of your background. And I think that from a government perspective, it's just so important to reiterate that conversation, because there's so many times that that hasn't been the case, that we've always looked to a certain type of person to be able to be an environmentalist and be a champion. And so I'm just really excited at this turning point, because we have so many good conversations happening and so many incredible supporters like you all in this room. You guys helped make this happen. So
Thank you
really
so
give
much.
yourselves a round of applause.
Great note to end on. That was a wonderful note to end on. So we'll take questions from the audience at this point. But first I wanted to ask, raise your hand if you learned something new from one of these speakers. I actually definitely did. Yeah, this was fantastic. And there is one thing about climate change that none of us actually brought up, and I wanted to make sure to highlight that, which is that as climate change worsens, we're going to be experiencing food shortages. And that's going to affect states like New Mexico more than other states, because we're already a state that has food deserts, for example, on tribal lands. And those food deserts, as Kelsey was saying, disproportionately affect people of color. And food scarcity is going to be one of the ways that we see increased fatalities in those populations as climate change worsens, just to make that connection. So who has questions for any of our three panelists today? I see Dorothy.
I'm going to ask everyone to speak into the microphone, because we are being recorded, and if you don't talk in the mic, we won't be able to hear the question.
I'm really excited about electric vehicles, because I think, we're attacking the coal, and in New Mexico pretty successfully. But I have a question about, here you mentioned all the charging stations in Albuquerque, but there's a large amount of land in New Mexico, and a lot of us travel that land. Is there hope for getting charging stations in some of the little places and some of the big places, and allowing us to get electric vehicles and not be stuck in Encino or something?
Yes, and if the panelists don't mind, I'll actually take this one, because one of the pieces of legislation that I worked on this year as a lobbyist was with Representative Angelica Rubio and Senator Woods, who is a Republican. And the bill was to encourage our utilities like P&M to submit electric vehicle infrastructure plans to our Public Regulatory Commission, and that bill did pass and it was signed by the governor. So at this point, the utilities will submit plans for building electric vehicle charging stations all around the state to be approved as a prudent expenditure at the PRC. And the goal of that legislation was to get charging stations in our in-betweens so that people don't have range anxiety, where you're driving and you're running out of charge and you have nowhere to stop. So I hope that that will make a big difference. And then I don't know if a couple people mentioned the VW settlement, so maybe you want to.
Yeah, so I can say that we are going to be meeting with the state next month and talking about exactly that issue of how the city can be working with the state to make sure that we're connecting up and really trying to be thoughtful about where we put our charging stations so that they're helping and supporting people that are traveling around the 40, traveling on the 25, all of our interstate traffic. And, I've already heard some fun things about Las Vegas has got a couple charging stations, I believe, up by one of their Applebee's. So it's really neat. If you ever have a chance, you can just plug in electric vehicle charging stations into Google Maps, and you can already see where a lot of those charging stations are located. And Electrify America and a couple different organizations are already putting their funding to helping support that. And then, as Brittany was mentioning, the VW settlement funding is available for communities across the state to apply for, to have projects largely subsidized. So, up to 80% project costs, that sort of level of support to put in these charging stations. So we have gotten exciting news that will be coming up hopefully within the next few months here.
And I'll add to the VW settlement that New Mexico got $18 million from that settlement, which actually is not that much compared to other states. And we've already spent some of that, and there's $12 million of it left. The money that was already spent, some of it was spent on diesel-related resources, which is not ideal. And so the Sierra Club and our ally organizations are going to be working with the new administration and the city in the coming years. We actually just got a grant to work on this issue to push our state agencies to use the remaining $12 million in VW funding entirely for the electric sector. So that's probably something you'll be seeing PR campaigns about in the next year or so. Do either of you want to say? Okay, let's move on to any other questions.
Yeah, I have a question. In fact, I got a bunch of questions, but I'll settle. I've picked one. One of the amazing statistics that I hadn't heard before was that Albuquerque says it's going to be net zero by 2030. And I just have to ask, from a technical point of view, how in the hell is that possible? Because one of the problems that I don't think has technically really been solved is the fact that we have to admit it. Solar energy you can only get when the sun shines, and when it's cloudy and when it's nighttime, it doesn't provide much. And so when it's not windy, when the sun is not shining, how is it you can achieve net zero by 2030? Some inventions that you've got in mind, or what?
So a lot of these conversations are happening right now, and sometimes there's a little bit of a difference too between actually utilizing in that moment renewable energy, and then the idea around offsetting. So you purchasing renewable energy that may not be flowing to you at that point, but you are, that's part of your purchase plan. But one of the things that we're talking about right now is battery electric storage. So, excuse me, I think this is kind of going in and out a little bit. But we're looking at battery electric storage. We're looking at a couple different, we also buy renewable energy that comes from wind, that comes sourced through P&M. So that's a big part of the equation as well. So, it's a little bit of a complicated question. I understand what you're asking there, and we're working on it. Mm-hmm.
For example, in their latest RFP process, P&M put out a bid for battery storage. And what that means is when you collect solar, you can store it for later. And so they're actively seeking proposals from businesses right now so that P&M can invest in battery storage so that they can onboard more renewables in their system. And battery storage is something that is literally changing day by day and getting better and better. And if P&M feels confident enough in battery storage at this point to invest in it, then I think we can be, they're a pretty conservative company. I mean, we could be pretty confident that it's moving in the right direction. Yes, there's a, yeah.
Hi. So regarding the Energy Transition Act, I mean, I think this is great that we are reducing our consumption of fossil fuels. On the flip side of that, 1/3 of New Mexico's state budget comes from oil and gas revenue. So are there plans to reduce that or transition away from that at least?
You know, you've asked the $64,000 question right there. And New Mexico, and it really makes me sad to say this, we've become, as politicians, so addicted to the money that comes from the fossil fuel industry in terms of needing that to get elected, that we've been extremely slow in doing anything really progressive to deal with the issue. I don't know if any of you saw the Sunday Journal paper that said touting ExxonMobil supplying $62 billion to New Mexico's budget over the next 40 years. Well, it was ExxonMobil that almost 38 years ago had their own scientists studying climate change. And they knew exactly what was happening, exactly what was happening. Where did they put their money? They didn't put it into new technologies and renewable energy. They put it into going after those scientists that were studying climate change to discredit them. When I was land commissioner, we were the first administration to actually sue the major companies for not paying their fair share. And Exxon was the only one that wouldn't pay. Well, we got the money, but we ended up having to spend 25% of it for legal fees. So to have on the bold front page of the Albuquerque Journal touting this huge resource from a study financed by ExxonMobil that hadn't been checked by the Albuquerque Journal really gets to the symptom of the problem that we face in New Mexico. And I tell you, there are not many politicians, people like me, that have the guts to stand up and say, I'm not going to do that. Stephanie Garcia-Richard, our new land commissioner, tried to get legislation passed this last session to get the big boom that's going to happen in the Permian Basin. They say there's more oil and gas there now than we've taken out of it with the fracking process. So Stephanie said, well, at least we can get them to pay what they're paying the folks in Texas. That bill didn't even get out of committee. So until we, as people that are interested in politics, hold our politicians' feet to the fire and say, I'm not supporting you. I'm going to support somebody that gets the question you just asked. And you're going to lose your position there. It's going to take that to really make a change. And there's going to be some pain in the process because you mentioned 1/3 of the income comes from oil and gas. It doesn't have to. We've got more intellectual capital in New Mexico than any place in the world, in our universities or in our national labs. But if you've got somebody that's paying some politician a lot of money to echo their thoughts, it's very hard to get that to rise. I can't say it any more directly than that. And we don't have time to beat around the bushes at this time.
Laura also has something to say about this.
I just wanted to add a little bit onto that. So if you look at the projections that the Energy Information Administration has put out, which is like the data arm of in the federal government, and they have shown the projections for the Permian Basin in particular, and production is expected to continue to increase at a really, really fast pace over the next few decades in the Permian. And so I think it's great that we have a governor and a legislature that has taken climate change more seriously than in the past, certainly. But I think that that's a big red flag for us. Like Ray said, it is very difficult for politicians to say no to the oil and gas industry, whether that's through campaign contributions or through scare tactics. And having covered the oil and gas industry in New Mexico for a while now, it pains me to see the rhetoric that comes out of the oil and gas industry, the trade groups in particular, where if you criticize oil and gas, you're taking workers' jobs away from them, when in fact, I think many people can likely understand that huge capitalist organizations are not all that concerned with their workers. But you can feel terrible if you criticize the oil and gas industry because you can be criticized for criticizing workers. And I think that the oil and gas industry is pretty successful in driving wedges in between people and in between communities, where of course we should be supporting workers in New Mexico. We should be supporting oil and gas workers to be having safe conditions and fair wages and the same protections that we all want to have, and we should be thinking about how to transition workers. But I think that the oil and gas issue is so tricky in New Mexico because so much of our budget is dependent on it, that it's hard to not have emotional conversations about that sometimes. And I think seeing one another as people and as us all kind of on the same side and wanting to protect our state and protect the future is New Mexico needs to get really serious on regulating oil and gas more strictly, whether that's protecting water, cutting methane emissions, or slowing development. We need to be really serious about that.
Just one other thing. These companies that we're talking about aren't New Mexico companies. These are global companies. And I fought tooth and nail to try and get these companies in the 90s to invest in their headquarters and other things to actually hire New Mexicans in New Mexico. They wouldn't do it. They said it's not cost effective. Well, the last thing I want to say is when I approached some of my friends in the legislature, and they are my friends, I've known them for most of my life, and I said, why won't you support Stephanie's idea of making sure New Mexico gets the same share that Texas gets? And I was dumbfounded. These are smart people. I love them dearly. And they said, well, the oil and gas companies will go someplace else. And I said, now wait a minute. We're talking about the resources in the ground in the Permian Basin. They're not going to move it. They've got to be here. That's why they're here. And they got red in the face, and I could see their blood pressure going up, and I could see it was going to be a homicide or a suicide, so I stopped. But that's what we're dealing with.
Okay, we got several people with questions, so guys, let's move it along.
I'll keep it tight.
Thanks. Mine is more a comment than a question. Language is so important. Climate change sounds normal. Let's use climate disruption, which is really what's happening today with floods and all the other things that are happening around the country. Oh, it's disruption. It's not change, okay, normal. Let's call it climate disruption. And also, the Journal on the 20th, I think, talked about the governor collaborating with oil and gas while working on renewables. So I think we need to know what she means by collaborating. Is she talking about more oil wells, more wellheads, more drilling, or just working on the resource they're providing until it runs out and then no more. So those are my comments.
Thank you. There's someone in stripes in the back.
Some of you may have heard about something that became a new concept to me, and that was carbon dioxide capture. It sounds weird and pie in the sky, recapturing carbon dioxide for using in soft drinks, but that's such a tiny part of the market. The big carbon dioxide capture would be to capture it and store it underground. Is that feasible? Is that real? Have you heard of it?
So I think that it's attractive for engineers and others to think about ways that we can get out of the problems that we have created, whether that was clean coal a decade ago, which is not a real thing, or the carbon capture. And I think that there's potential for carbon sequestration and planting forests and things, but I feel like at this point scientists have been very clear about what we need to do, and that is cut emissions. And we know we need to do that, we know how to do it, and getting distracted by these sort of geoengineering schemes, I think, diverts our resources and energy.
And I would say amen to that, and just give you one clear example, and you guys already know this, but most of our neighbors don't, that over the last 5 years, the oceans have been at their highest temperature, each year getting higher. This year it's going to be even higher. 93% of the heat added by this climate disruption has been harvested by the oceans. If that hadn't happened, we would be 97 degrees centigrade warmer in this ambient. We wouldn't be here. So I guess that's what I'm saying. We've gotten rid of 60% of the mammals on this planet since the 1970s. We can go through that list, and it's really depressing. The point is, it's get serious about the emissions. Get serious about weaning off the fossil fuel. 40 years, we're now talking about, all the studies are saying we're lucky if we got 12 years. 12 years. And there are a couple of young people in this room. 12 years from there, they're going to be living in a very different world, and it makes me want to cry when I say that.
Thank you. Oh, did you want? Okay. Okay. Next question.
Hi. So I guess it's kind of for Ray. As everybody knows, we have like the world's hotspot for methane over the Four Corners area. Do you think that going into the Permian Basin, since it's not a new field, but I guess it's a new pocket that they're revisiting on our side of the Texas-New Mexico border, do you think that we can go in, or the state will require some kind of capture? I've been told by oil and gas engineers that infrastructure to capture the methane is just, way too expensive. But if it's done from the very beginning, maybe you wouldn't have that global warming potential.
I'm going to let Laura make a comment, and then Ray.
Okay, thanks.
So as I understand it, the state is looking at a methane capture rule as part of the climate initiatives from the governor, and it's done in other states. So if it can happen in other states and business manages to boom there, it can certainly happen here in New Mexico, right? Colorado is one of the states doing it. And I think it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, like, it's really time for New Mexicans to push back on the oil and gas industry. They have made a lot of money off of us, and it's okay for us to say, these certain measures need to be implemented. And I don't think that, it's unrealistic to expect methane capture.
I think the tough thing that we're facing right now, because, you know, even a decade ago, the satellites that were flying over the Earth looking down saw this big cloud in the Four Corners area and said, what the heck is that? It's the largest methane escape from the oil and gas industry on planet Earth. Now with the increase in the Permian Basin, it's going to dwarf what we had in the Four Corners. Now what really is tough here is that these wells, with using the fracking technology, which is a wonderful technology, if we didn't have climate change and we didn't need clean air, clean water, and good food, would be great, is that we've got a situation where the field itself, the first 2 to 3 years is where you get maximal production. And then it drops precipitously. And what happens is the big companies then sell it to the smaller companies. Then the smaller companies, it ends up with mom and pop operations, literally 3 or 4 barrels coming out of each well. None of those folks have the resources to develop a pipeline or the right technologies. So if you don't get it before they drill the well, you're not gonna get it. And they're not gonna grandfather back any of the old ones. Because the idea is to make as much money as you can for your stockholders. I mean, I don't know any other way to say that. So I'm not holding my breath, and maybe I ought to because there's so much out there.
I have just a quick comment to a little bit of food for thought, jumping off of what Laura was mentioning since she brought up cap and trade. So when we were talking earlier about the VW settlement funding, it's really great that VW did something bad that we can then benefit off of and have a huge pot of money that we can put towards electrification projects. But we're always wondering what happens when that funding runs out. And so California has already started looking at their cap and trade program and using revenue from that cap and trade program as a replacement for the VW settlement funding to fund electrification projects. So just want to put that out there.
And my comment was going to be that the Lujan Grisham administration and her cabinet secretaries at Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources and the Environment Department are working on a methane rule, and there will be public comment on that methane rule. So you should all keep that on your radar, and when they ask for public comment, you should say, yes, we want a methane rule in this state, and more than that, we desperately need a methane rule in this state.
Could I just make one, and it'll be brief. John Wesley Powell was a guy that explored the western United States, 150 years ago. And he had the idea that out of watersheds, you ought to make political boundaries. And the idea being is when somebody pissed in the river at the top, somebody in the bottom knew about it and cared about it. Well, we didn't do that. So we really don't connect the land and political decisions. We've made it even worse, and this is where I'm counting on Lujan Grisham and the rest of the crew, and I love them dearly, is that we have all of these silos. We have the Game and Fish Department, looks after the wildlife. We have the state engineer that looks after the water. We have the Environment Department that regulates food and water quality. We have the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources, which looks after if you make an oil spill. We have the land office that leases the land for different uses. And with primate behavior, you're gonna protect your silo. You're not gonna collaborate and cooperate with the other silos. That's historically what's happened. So what we need right now, more than anything, is an administration that says we're gonna do things completely differently. And we're gonna pull that together, and we're gonna have a cabinet that's based on looking at the whole thing systemically, where we all work together versus one agency telling another agency, you can go to hell, we're not gonna do that. That's our purview. It's gonna take that sort of fundamental, basic bone marrow change to get us to the next point. And folks, when we elect people, we got to look them in the eye and ask them if they really understand the big picture over a long period of time. Because that long period of time, I hate to keep saying this because, you know, when I traveled with Dr. Jane, she kept saying to me, you know, if you depress people so much and they give up all their hope, they're not going to do anything. Well, I agree with that to a point. But if you don't know what's at risk, you're not going to step up and say, stop, let's do something different.
I think we have time for one more question. Does that sound right?
Going. Okay. Oh, we got another one back here, if we can squeeze it in.
Okay. So I had one that's kind of feels like a little bit of left field because we haven't really talked about it, but I noticed that there was a proposal in the city council at one point about one-use plastics being banned, and I wondered what happened to that. And then number two, I love the idea of the electric cars and all the infrastructure for that, but I'm wondering if there's anything being addressed towards public transit as well.
So I'll take the plastic ban question since I had to sit at the city council meeting all night as I watched it get passed. So, so good news, plastic ban has been passed. City council passed it, and then the mayor signed just last month, and so it's going to be moving out here. And so your question is really good though, because solid waste right now, our solid waste department is working on doing the education campaign related to that, educating and answering some of the questions that you're probably thinking. You just asked now about how is it going to work, what does it look like, what changes are there going to be. Specifically, they're focusing right now on single-use plastic bags, and so I would recommend to everyone to start stocking up on your Trader Joe's reusable bags. And then also, Environmental Health Department Food Safety Division is going to be the actual enforcement arm of that ban. So they're going to be doing it similarly to how they do a lot of their inspections, checking to make sure restaurants are not offering plastic bags as a part of their sort of carry-out process. So that's as good of information as I can give now, but I definitely ask you guys to stay tuned. We're going to be doing a big push on that here in the next few months, and yeah, talking a lot more about plastics.
Okay. And the second part of her question was about electric in the public transportation, which you have been working on.
So good news, we had a lot of folks who did a really quick turnaround and gave letters of support for the city, who submitted a grant proposal to the Federal Transit Administration to ask for funding for 5 new electric buses, 5 new 40-foot electric buses. So we're hoping that grant gets approved. That's our big push and big success story right now. We had at least somewhere between 10 to 15 letters of support from organizations across the city and throughout the state. So we're moving in that direction. We're looking at all of our opportunities, applying for the grants as they come on board. You know, we're looking at, you know, transit is really committed to making sure that electric buses happen here in the city. And so the form that they'll take is still in formation right now, but we're making efforts.
Hopefully some of the $12 million that we have to spend of the VW settlement money will also go to public transportation. I think
Okay.
Folks,
I'm counting.
can you
'cause
imagine?
we have one more last question.
Can you imagine if we had a Democratic president that got this, and a Senate that got this, and a House that got this? New Mexico, literally, we're ready. We're going. I mean, with quality people like this. But that's, I mean, what's at risk at 2020? Those of us with the chromosomal defect for politics in this room, is there something that should motivate us more than that?
Final question.
Okay, lightning round.
Okay, thank you. Just going back to the heavy snowfall of this year, this past winter, the river running really fast and all that. Is that some of the high and lows that you were talking about? Is this just going to happen this year and we're not going to see it? Is there a way to predict that, for next year? My family is from northern New Mexico. They have a fruit orchard in Chimayo where they still utilize the acequias, and they water their land from the snowfall from the Truchas Peaks. And every year they don't use it for, to as a way of life. It's just there because we have it. But not every year they can water, their land and their trees. So again, going back, is this just the high and lows that we're going to be having from here on out?
This year is unusual. This year is not something that people should be expecting in the future. I think years like we had last year are probably going to be more and more common. And if you look at the Rio Grande drawing in Albuquerque or south of Albuquerque, that really started happening in the late 90s and wasn't something that happened prior to that time period.
Again, I think I just irrigated today, so I use the acequia system for my fruit trees and grapevines. And the unfortunate, and I love it, I mean, this year is going to be a year to celebrate. And as Laura said, we got to take it, opportunity to celebrate it. But folks, this is an anomaly. It's not going to happen for a long time in the future. And the sad thing is we don't know.
So thank you, everybody. Again, I'm Brittany Fallon with the Sierra Club, and thank you to Laura, Ray, and Kelsey so much for lending us their expertise this evening.
Hey, Brittany.